Good evening. I'm Beverly Bain.
And I'm Minsuk Lee.
Welcome to Censuring the Neoliberal University, Academic Freedom, Donors and Equity. This event is organized and streamed on Facebook and YouTube by Scholars Strike Canada. The event is also closed captioned.
Well, let us begin by acknowledging the sacred land on which we live and work. For over 15,000 years, this land has been home to Indigenous people who have lived and continue to live in relation with the land in ways that have proven to be ecologically sustainable, vital, and deep in our humanity by honoring our relations. I'm speaking to you today from Toronto, Takaronto. This land is the territory of the Mississauga of the Credit First Nation, Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat, and Huron Indigenous peoples. Today, this meeting place of Takaronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to be here amongst them in conversation with their history and continuing activism to ensure the values and practices that protected the land, cared for the people, and planned for a peaceable future remain alive today.
In April of this year, the Canadian Association of University Teachers, CAUT, took the extraordinary step of censuring the University of Toronto, one of Canada's top-ranked universities, for its decision to cancel the hiring of a well-respected German-based international human rights worker and scholar, Dr. Valentina Azarova. Dr. Azarova was the chosen candidate by the search committee for director of the International Human Rights Program, which is housed in the law school. But things quickly changed in a matter of days following the offer of the position to Dr. Azarova. On September 4th, the Dean of Law was advised that a prominent alumnus and funder objected to the hire based on Dr. Arova's scholarship that was deemed critical in the occupied Palestinian territories. On September 6th, the Dean rescinded the offer of employment to Dr. Azarova. According to a statement by the CAUT's membership that voted to censure the University of Toronto, and I quote, "The facts that have emerged strongly suggest the decision to cancel Dr. Azarova's appointment was politically motivated, and as such constitutes a serious breach of widely recognized principles of academic freedom," end quote. Joining us to discuss the issue of censure and academic freedom are Professors Anne Verheemen, Professor of Law and History at the University of Toronto, Professors Melanie Newton, Department of History at the University of Toronto, and Professor Louise J. Room, Professor in the Faculty of Law at the University of Toronto, and Mr. David Robinson, Executive Director, Canadian Association of University Teachers. Welcome all.
Welcome and thank you for joining us today. Professor Room and Professor Verheemen, let's begin with you. This is your faculty. Dr. Azarova was the unanimous choice of the hiring committee to head the International Human Rights Program, and typically, university hiring processes are highly confidential. But this situation has exploded onto the international scene in a public and quite damning way, and it's raised some troubling questions. As faculty members in the School of Law, what are your greatest concerns here?
Maybe I can start with that. First, thank you to Scholars Strike for taking up this issue. We're really, really grateful to get the message out as widely as possible. So you're right, Minsuk, that university hiring decisions are usually completely confidential and there is not meant to be any outside interference. It became very early, it became clear early on as this scandal broke that there had been a very serious breach of confidentiality, and it stemmed from, as we later fully discovered, from the Office of Advancements. So the people whose job it is to stroke donors and to get people to make donations to the university actually revealed confidential information to a donor about a search process. And that is, in anybody's book, that's beyond the pale. That is just not a thing that one can do. So when we began to get wind that this had happened, then of course, efforts started to try to make sure that that the effort by the donor was not going to be successful. And that turned out to be completely wasted energy. Lots of people wrote to the dean, telephoned the dean, tried to persuade the dean not to withdraw from this appointment process. And he wasn't hearing any of it. He wouldn't even respond to many of these arguments. And frankly, that just increased our level of worry, right? So if the dean will not even speak to his colleagues about what his decision was based on, et cetera, what the concerns of his faculty members are about something, it sends off warning bells. It makes you think, oh, there must be something wrong here. Otherwise, why would you refuse to speak to people whose only concern is the health of the International Human Rights Program? People were not looking to make trouble. They initially were trying to do all of this behind the scenes in order to prevent this from blowing up in public. It only made it into the newspapers ultimately after the dean made his decision public, and it was obvious that there was nothing further that could be done to try to sort this out more quietly.
You know, it is really a case of really thinking robustly. How do we connect collegial governments with academic freedom? Because even after this process occurred, Denise, myself, and a number of us colleagues who were concerned about this tried to begin a conversation internally among our 50-strong faculty members at the law faculty. There was no listserv that we could actually write to and have back and forth exchanges. It was all very much controlled by the dean's office, so a colleague created one. And it was startling to watch colleagues want to withdraw from the conversation, remove themselves from the listserv, not want to participate. And that was just one of many different reactions. And so the real failure of collegial governance also is a story here, but it also then begins to, as it snowballed, as it became a media issue, then it also became an issue for the president's office. At first, with the appointment of Bonnie Patterson, a former president of Trent University, to do an inquiry. There was considerable concern about that because she was an administrator's administrator who herself was embroiled in academic freedom foibles, and CAUT had done some studies on that matter. And there were real concerns about her ability to actually do the job well and fairly. Many of us were actually suggesting, like in any labor setting, you have a panel of people. Ultimately, the president's office, Bonnie Patterson stepped down, and the Honorable Thomas Cromwell, formerly of the Supreme Court of Canada, was appointed as the sole and single reviewer of the matter, and which then, of course, resulted in the Cromwell report that we then had in March.
Amber, the university denied that there was any outside influence in this report, right? That was done by Supreme Court Justice Thomas Cromwell, who conducted the independent query. And it seems like a situation of a white powerful man investigating other white powerful men. Could you talk about your reactions to the Cromwell report and others in the law faculty? Because, we know that a group of you did protest this. Members resigned from the actual process. So share some of your concern and for others regarding this report.
Well, let's keep in mind, the Honorable Thomas Cromwell, formerly of the Supreme Court of Canada, and there was hope that this is a gentleman who had the experience of adjudicating complex matters, understood standards of review, understood how to weigh and balance evidence, understood even issues of judicial ethics around conflicts and appearances of impartiality. And so as lawyers, as law professors, there was a sense of relief that it wasn't Bonnie Patterson anymore, but that it was Thomas Cromwell. But then the report came out and it began to dawn upon us that there was something fishy in the report. Denise and I and a few others wrote a variety of analyses of the report, and I can speak to the part that I did, and I'm going to ask Denise to speak to the issue of how he weighs the evidence. But one of the big issues was that he acknowledges that there was a leak of the hiring, that there was a leak, that was an external email from a professor outside of Canada written to CIJA, the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, warning CIJA that there was this person possibly appointed to the university's directorship. and that CJA should do something. And I have the actual language here in the email. The email was prompting CJA, quote, through quiet discussions, top university officials will realize that this appointment is academically unworthy and that a public protest campaign will do major damage to the university, including in fundraising, end quote. That's on the Cromwell report, page 32. So that email goes from CJA to David Spiro, who is the judge at the center of this issue as well, an alum who also was a member of the board of directors of CJA. And so it's David Spiro who speaks with our advancement officers at Simcoe Hall making inquiries about this. Now, the real question is how do we understand the conversation? And is the standard of analysis appropriate? And Denise can speak to this more effectively than I can, so I'll turn it to her in a moment. But in law, we talk about standards of review. We talk about modes of analysis. We talk about, it's not just simply what's possible as a possible outcome, but what's probable, what's plausible in light of all of the circumstances. And does it seem plausible that when a donor has a phone call with the fundraising arm of the university raising concerns about a hiring that he never should have known about, that was a breach of confidentiality, that it's anything other than quiet, soft power pressure from a donor? And that's the concern here, is that it's a donor wielding some influence precisely with the organ of the university where that influence is most felt, known, and pursued. That's the concern, is that sure, anything is possible. It's also possible that I've been to the moon, but it's not plausible. It's not probable. I'm not trained as an astronaut. You would know that from a simple Google search. So that's the situation. Maybe I'll ask Denise to better explain that, because she's done some work in this area.
Okay, and just before I go to Denise, I just want to say that you know, it's clear that you know, having one individual who's a white powerful man do this process or do an investigation is also problematic in this case, because we're talking about very high profile white men with power who are making these decisions, who are also influencing, you know, decisions behind the scene. And then we have a white powerful man doing the investigation. You know, Denise, should there have been a team of people doing this process as opposed to this one individual?
Oh, absolutely. And that point was made to President Gertler. So the standard practice, David Robinson will know this better than most, is to set up tripartite panels to investigate these kinds of things, in the hope that between the three people who are appointed, having different perspectives, that they will discipline one another, that there will be a weight countering whatever predispositions people might bring to the process. So the university breaches all proper procedures when it sets this up as a one-man operation. There's so many things that the University of Toronto did wrong in this whole process that you could design a law school course around what not to do if you are a major institution and something and a scandal blows up on you. There's also more problems with the Cromwell report than even in a full hour we can even enumerate. But I want to pick up two, taking off from where Anver left off. The first is that we didn't actually know until the Cromwell report was handed down just how overt, obvious, bald the attempt at interference had been from David Spiro. We had only, you know, intimations based on the intelligence we'd been able to gather up until then. So we are grateful to Thomas Cromwell for writing all that up and revealing the emails and all of the rest of it. The first problem with the report is what he himself does with that. He completely soft pedals the extent to which this is interference that we should be concerned about. He says, oh, no, David Spiro and CJA are just sharing information with the university. That is outrageous. And I say that as somebody who was very hopeful when Cromwell took over this process, that he was actually going to be fair-minded about gathering the evidence and telling the story. For me, that was the first signal that this train was going off the rails. The second big problem with what he did was he talked to everybody who'd been involved. He talked to the dean, he talked to the chair of the selection committee, he talked to all the players in these events. And his process basically boils down to this. He gathered the information about what had happened at the advancement office. He sat down with the dean. He said to the dean, so tell me what your reason was for pulling the plug on this appointment. And were you influenced by the fact that David Spiro, was kind of telling you that maybe this would not be a good idea? And the dean said, surprise, surprise, no, I wasn't influenced by David Spiro at all. I had these other reasons for not proceeding with this hire. And Mr. Cromwell says, oh, okay, that's good enough for me. And just decides to go forward with the rest of the account, not actually testing that, not actually asking any questions about how plausible an account of his own actions that was, as Enver says. This is completely not the way any adjudicative body settles these kinds of issues. And you don't have to, and I think this is important for people to understand, you don't have to think that the dean was lying when he told Cromwell that he was not motivated by Spiro's interjection. You don't have to believe he was lying. You just have to believe that maybe it was convenient for him to understand himself as acting for good reasons, not for bad reasons. So he found some purportedly good reasons, which are very weak reasons in the judgment of anybody who reads this report objectively, very weak reasons that he relies on to support his decision. And Cromwell just accepts this hook, line, and sinker. No questioning, no testing, no hint, no indication that he thinks that there's anything a bit fishy about this. Everybody who I've talked to who reads the report as an outsider says, whoa, what was that about? That's the fishiest thing I've ever seen. And yet Cromwell could not see this, could not call this for what it was.
Well, perhaps, another issue while he was writing the report, Cromwell gave a keynote for the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs, the very organization that was the organization that started off the entire investigation to begin with, that had the donor on the board of the Center for Israel and Jewish Affairs calling advancement. And so that's what's kicked it off in the first place. So Cromwell actually giving a keynote to CJA while writing this report, sets off a number of, dubious questions. And David, I want to bring you in here now from CAUT's perspective. CAUT took a very unusual step to censure the University of Toronto. It's a very rare step. Tell us about the process of university censure and the steps that were taken to invoke it, and what convinced the membership of CAUT to censure U of T. In particular, can you talk about how academic freedom is infringed here and how that comes into play around the hiring of this position, David?
Great. Thanks so much, Ben Sook, and thanks so much for the invitation to be here. And thanks for Scholar Strike for organizing this. I think it's a really important conversation for us to have. And I also appreciate being on a panel with people I really admire now, because they've done incredible organizing work locally that's helped to make censure have real force. So my gratitude goes out to them as well. Where we came to the censure motion, and censure is something that we rarely use, and it's been used, I think, in the past 20 years twice. So this is the third time in the past 2 decades that we've gone the censure route, and it really is a last resort. If we can't resolve a problem in any other way, censure is the last sanction we have to use, which calls upon, essentially, it calls upon the academic community, both here in Canada and internationally, to recognize this is an institution and administration that has violated key foundational principles such as academic freedom or collegial governance or institutional autonomy. And as such, you need to be aware that you shouldn't engage in any speaking engagements at the university, that you shouldn't participate with the administration in any of its administrative duties, to try and call them out as a pariah within the international community. Where do we get to this in CAUT? It's an interesting story. I was actually alerted over the course of the long weekend when the events were happening by someone who I had worked with many years ago, who was a friend of Dr. Azarova, and said, yeah, you may be interested in this from CAT's perspective. I'm not sure if it's an academic freedom issue, but this is happening. And he sent me a bunch of material. And as I read it, I thought, oh my God, this is incredible. And as we investigated a bit more, and as things came out in the media, we were quite concerned about the violations of academic freedom here, and institutional autonomy and collegial governance. It's absolutely reprehensible that any outside vested interest should have control over decision making or influence decision making within the university. That is a fundamental violation of the reasons that universities and colleges exist, which is to be independent, shared research focused institutions that serve the public interest, not a particular vested interest. That's the ideal, and that's what we always strive for. So I think when the matter came to CAUT, we did our own investigation based on materials that we had at the time. The university subsequently launched first the Patterson investigation, then the Cromwell investigation. When the matter came to our council meeting, censure was supported unanimously with only one abstention. I think what really convinced people was going through the Cromwell report in some ways, because Cromwell actually laid the case for us. And in some ways, I've been referring to the Cromwell report as kind of like the Mueller investigation in the US. There is, this sense that Donald Trump was exonerated, but then you read the documents and think, oh my God, this is terrible. And that led to impeachment. So it was a very, very similar kind of process for CAT Council. It's absolutely clear that the only thing that changed on the morning of September 4th, the university was still pursuing a work permit for Dr. Azarova. Within an hour and a half, things went off the rails. The only thing that changed, the dean was alerted that a donor had called and raised concerns. And over the course of a long weekend, suddenly springs into action, and had no interest in the hiring process earlier, suddenly springs into action and cancels the hiring. When we talked to the university administration about this, and as we were trying to resolve the matter, because we were hoping that the threat of censure might move them, their response to us was, but Cromwell, he's unimpeachable. You can't challenge Cromwell. And my response was, I hope that's not what we as a profession tell our students, that just because someone comes from a privileged background, has lots of letters after their name, that we don't challenge what they say. We always interrogate what people say, no matter what kind of pedigree they come from or what kind of credentials they have. That's part of the learning process. So I was quite taken aback by that, this notion that we as a profession just shouldn't question Cromwell in his investigation. So I think that also, raised the back of council a bit. And so I think based on the evidence, it was overwhelmingly that this does not pass the basic smell test. There's been a serious violation of academic freedom here.
David, it seems as though the Cromwell report actually worked against the university's interest in trying to preserve the decision that was made not to offer Azarova, Dr. Azarova, the appointment. So it seemed like it actually was flopped in their faces. So I want to go to Professor Newton. You initiated and circulated a petition among Black faculty, intellectuals, and students that called for the Right Honorable Michael Shah to respect the censure and cancel her talk at the University of Toronto School of Social Work. Clearly, you recognize the serious implications that the undermining of academic freedom has for everyone, but in particular for Black academics and students, I'm assuming, at the university, and the importance of the CAUT censure. Can you talk about this?
Absolutely. And again, I want to say thank you so much for organizing this Scholar Strike. And I really want to thank my colleagues in the law school who over the course of the last academic year refused to accept what was taking place, and to CAUT for really getting us to the point where a faculty member like myself really was able to get involved in what I do see as a fundamental, really grave threat to academic freedom, precisely at a moment when supposedly academic institutions, they claim to be committing themselves to being more representative, to promoting equity. So I saw there were a number of things that really disturbed and concerned me. Um, and I would say that letter, I think, was signed by, in the end, more than 100 Black, as you say, Black intellectuals and students and faculty members from across, not just in Canada, not just U of T, who I think people have a lot of reasons why they would have signed, but I think shared some of the same sense that this is really, in many ways, an attack on what is in fact decades of struggle to make universities more accountable. And we're living in a moment right now where there are these profound conversations about institutional discrimination, about institutional racism, and at the root of those kinds of challenges that we face is that the lack of accountability, and precisely this idea that somehow you can bring, lots of diverse faces into an institution, but you don't have to change who's in power at the top. They don't have to change their behavior. They don't have to be accountable to anyone. They can just sort of cherry pick when they want to apply equity and when they don't. And that is an incredibly dangerous and toxic way to approach running an institution. So for me, this year I was actually part of the Anti-Black Racism Task Force, this was a committee of Black students and faculty and staff at U of T that drafted a report that ironically was presented to the university on the same day that ex-Governor General Michaëlle Jean said that she would cancel her speaking engagement. And those recommendations were accepted by the president of the university. But equity is not, as I said, a small group of unaccountable white administrators or administrators who feel that they are unaccountable, just cherry picking when they will, like who and when will be allowed to, approach the seat of power. This is not the university is not Ancien Regime France, right? So this is a completely inappropriate way to run a public institution. So I felt that this lack of accountability really, it undermines any trust that I might have had. And that I have to say that level of trust was not terribly high because I do think there's a long history at U of T of instrumentalizing the struggles, particularly of Black and Indigenous people, as a means of making themselves look good, which has long disturbed me. But this really felt like that there is this real, like on the one hand, you have this language around opposition to anti-Black racism and institutional transformation and so on. And at the same time, you have this very clear commitment and a doubling down on the part of the president in the letter that he sent to all faculty after the CAUT censure was announced, where there was no acceptance of any responsibility, no language around self-reflection, no recognition. There's been no recognition really publicly from the president of the impact that this whole situation has had on faculty and students as we're living through a pandemic, as we're all sort of struggling to support our students at this time of crisis. There is absolutely no expression of any kind of meaningful empathy or responsibility or self-reflection. And to me, that is not ethical leadership, and it is not the kind of leadership that is actually going to implement the kinds of structural changes that we need to make this institution a place where racism does not thrive. So everything about this spoke to actually, you talk left and walk right. That's the real politics here. And I just find that this is, having spent several months this year on the Anti-Black Racism Task Force, which was a major commitment of time and effort and emotional labor, and to see this blatant lack of real investment in the kinds of changes that are needed to make those kinds of the recommendations meaningful, I found deeply, deeply offensive. I think it's an offense to students, it's an offense to the public. These are our colleagues who have done this, right? And it is uncollegial behavior, unprofessional and unacceptable.
I want to ask, one of the things that I found quite disturbing about it is the implication in terms of what it means when, as academics, as scholars, as students, there are certain knowledges that we are not allowed to speak about, right? What does that do? So for instance, I mean, this whole process, this whole situation is a result of universities and governments denying the right of a particular kind of scholarship, that being scholarship on Palestine, that actually, that speak to human rights abuses on the part of the state of Israel towards Palestinian. And what does that mean in the context of other kinds of and other kinds of power bodies within the university that says we are not going to fund particular kinds of research on particular kinds of Black scholarship, or on particular kinds of Indigenous scholarship, or particular kinds of Middle Eastern scholarship? What does that do to those of us who do this work, who actually are in those situations, who live within those contexts? So, Melanie, if you want to just add something there, and then we can go on to the, to further conversation, I'd appreciate it.
No worries. Sorry, my internet connection is a little treacherous. Just going out for a couple of minutes. So I think there is a long and well understood history of the use.
We'll come back to, are you with us?
Here? I think it does this occasionally. I'm so sorry. It would pick this moment. It's been great all day. But there is a long history of, donors seeking to influence. We have no control over how donors behave. Like, they can behave as badly as they like. The people who should be accountable, though, are the university administrators and the Office of Advancement, and people like the president and the provost, who have to decide how they behave and what decisions they make in response to such behavior. They're the people who are accountable. And there's a long history of the use of donor influence to exclude certain communities. It is a really important aspect of the history of institutional racism at institutions of higher learning. And it has been applied to different groups at different points in history. And I do believe, CAUT itself was established in part because of the history of discrimination against Jewish academics, against people who were supposedly communists, against opponents of the Vietnam War. I mean, it's a long list of people who whose political positions or ethnicities have been used as a means of excluding them from the space of the university. So personally, the implications of this, the fact that, I think it's important to remember Dr. Azarova herself, she is a human rights scholar who works on Palestine, but it really, at the root of this, is apparently a willingness to, you have to think, well, what about Palestinians and Palestinians who actually are doing this kind of work? So I think there's a long history of this that we are all very familiar with, in terms of the use against Black scholars, so that certain kinds of questions could not be asked, certain kinds of research could not be funded, certain kinds of classes could not be taught. I mean, I teach subject matter, I teach the history of the Caribbean, that being educated in Canada, in the 1990s was simply not available because those people were not there, because historically they had been excluded from the university. So the intergenerational consequences of this kind of behavior are staggering, and the intellectual impoverishment that results for students and for the wider society, it is hard to, it takes a long time to rectify. So our university leaders, who seem to think, and what is also striking for me is the way in which, in a lot of the communications, there's this idea that nothing happened here, just business as usual, is the university's position. And I think administrators need to remember that they are not the university, they're administrators. And that they are accountable to a wider community in the university, that they seem in many ways to be feeling like they're not really accountable to. They don't have to explain themselves. So that is, for me, speaking as a Black scholar and thinking about the impact that this had on my learning, on the kind of learning that my children receive in school, on the experiences that a lot of Black students have. Like, this is the consequences of this are something that, you know, I live with every day. And it's debilitating, it's wrong. And it is clear to me, again, that for all the talk about a commitment to challenging anti-Black racism, that there is no real empathy on the part of the university administrators who are involved in this for what that means to people, right? And what the implications of that are for society. There's no real grasp. They're unable to connect those dots, or unwilling to connect those dots.
Yeah, Professor Newton, I have to say, you know, when you're talking about the subsequent chill effect of something like this, the way in which it cascades and travels, not just in the faculty, but throughout campus and throughout our sector, I think that's quite significant here. And by all accounts, Azarova's work and her position on Palestine are seen as quite mainstream. This is not a radical position that Azarova has been pushing forward. Azarova's position is that the settlements are illegal and the occupations cannot continue indefinitely. Under international law, her positions are seen as quite mainstream. Now, what are we to take away from what's happened here is that people are being disciplined, that Palestinian rights, that international law, these issues are essentially, you know, you can't speak about them. You better be silent, because we've heard about this one issue, but how many more are taking place with quiet conversations and with that kind of, you know, due diligence, all those things in that coached language? I wonder, you know, Anvar and Denise, can you speak about that and the consequences and the impact in the faculty and amongst your members?
Sure, you can. I mean, look, as this issue broke out, it became, there's a larger history of this at U of T. Dr. David Healy, Dr. Barbara Olivieri, Dr. Azarova right now, these are just three at U of T. You know, right now, UNC, University of North Carolina, has chosen not to give a tenured position to a journalist for her work on the New York Times project. I think it's called the 1619 project, if I remember the date correctly. And again, out of deference to trustees and donors and governors who control the university. So we do have a problem. So there's a couple of things that I want to address, but I also want to address the issue of Palestine that you brought up. One is we're a public university, and to the extent that we get public funding, increases or decreases are subject to somewhat transparent, accountable measures that ultimately we as voters can address at the next election. But in the context of private philanthropy, and in another hat, I wear a hat of a director where I am fundraising, I am looking for donors. And it's increasingly important because public expenditure on higher education has gone down. And so as we see the decrease and then the turn to private philanthropy, how do we, in the context of privacy considerations, donor privacy interests, how do we nonetheless create transparent governance? And this is where oftentimes we speak separately about academic freedom and we dissociate it from collegial governance. But what's important here is to see how collegial governance is what makes possible academic freedom, in particular when you have a turn to private philanthropy. And I haven't seen how it is we manage collegial governance in the context of donor relations. It's at the law faculty, it's a dean's office thing, managed by an advancement office, separate from the faculty and the governance mechanisms that we do have. And so there's a larger question for us to consider as university professionals. But with respect to the kinds of questions, I do think that this issue, look, it could have been the Mining Association of Canada as it affects our Indigenous peoples and questions around natural resource management. It could have been the Oilmen's Association of Canada. In this case, it's CEJA with respect to its advocacy on Israel and its concern about Azarova. The fact is that for us, other university units, our responsibility has to be in these instances that we nonetheless find a space to center the voices that are decentered in this conversation. So, you know, one of the things I'm really proud of is working with the colleagues to help promote a project on Hearing Palestine, where as a project that's a project of the History Department, the Center for the Study of the US, and the Institute of Islamic Studies, it's an opportunity to think about that, to think about what would it mean to center Palestine voices. But I will tell you, at our initial events, we were contacted about risk assessment. We were asked, have you taken measures to precautionary measures in the case things are up? Now, we've had controversial topics in the past. We've talked about Kashmir, we've talked about national security. We ran a hotline for students approached by national security, but I've never had someone come to me with this murmurs of concern around a program like we did for Hearing Palestine. So it does raise questions, is that how do we show, in the context of managing my programming out of the Institute and the work of my colleagues, how do we protect the academic freedom of those who are putting on a program, even if you are concerned about risk assessment, even if you are concerned about the mental health of other students who have concerns around the topic, but how do we nonetheless balance that with our commitment to academic freedom? And for as long as we identify only some issues as subject to these risk assessment issues, and with others are simply free of concern, we raise real questions about our commitment to the freedom of inquiry at the university.
Can I say something on this point as well? I think, I think one of the things in terms of with what we've lived through in the last year, with the serious conversations at a global level about institutional, like racialized violence and systems of exclusion, advancement, university advancement is a really key site for the enactment of that kind of racial inequality. You can look at, a lot of elite universities like the University of Toronto and look at who leads the advancement teams, who do they typically approach as donors, for what purpose. I used to be the director of a program at the University of Toronto that it was the Caribbean Studies program, and there was, it was a struggle. It was a huge struggle because we clearly were not a priority for the university. And it was very clear, what the issue was, right? We don't count, right? So again, like the very kinds of issues that a lot of us study in terms of histories of race, histories of inequality, are really deeply embedded in the structures of the university. And historically, in many ways, rather than trying to learn from that kind of knowledge that's being produced in this space in order to reflect on what they do, there is somehow the assumption that, the academics go and they play and they do what, and we know what's real, we know what matters. It's arrogance. It's this incredible arrogance that needs to be, it needs to be rethought as a model. And the other thing to sort of tie into the other point that Anver made is that we are living right now globally in a moment where we are facing this a broad range of, and they're not new, but Anver mentioned Kashmir. There's Hindu nationalism, extreme right-wing Zionism, and so these are right-wing movements that are in some cases trying to rebrand themselves as equity categories that are beyond criticism, that should be protected in the way that, say, a struggle over anti-Black racism or against Islamophobia, for LGBTQ rights, and so that somehow this is a category, these ideological movements somehow are trying to sort of take over the space and put themselves beyond criticism as almost, occupying the space of equity. And that is incredibly dangerous because, as I said, these are ideological movements that have particular geopolitical aims. And they do represent a real challenge and a danger to the democratic functioning of institutions, because it's not entirely clear that a lot of these movements are really that committed to the integrity of these institutions. So this is, I think, for people who don't have any personal connection to the issue of Palestine, there is the issue of, again, the fact that this ultimately is targeted against hearing about the experiences or learning about Palestinians. But it ties in to a range of other movements that are alive in the world. And we are too accustomed, I think, in North America to thinking about right-wing movements as white supremacy, and thinking that because white supremacy has certain groups that it tends to not like, including Black people, that there can't be any similarities between certain kinds of far-right groups. And in fact, they are, right? And you can see that very clearly if you look at right-wing publications on the internet, that they are occupying some of the same ecosystems of disinformation. And it's really, academic freedom is a key bulwark against those kinds of challenges, which are fundamental anti-democratic challenges that we should all, again, they are an issue for all of us, regardless of who we are.
That's a really interesting, framing that you've given it, because, when we think about what's happening today globally, I mean, we've seen also uprising, and we're actually having this conversation in the context of, the situation in Palestine at this moment, right? Where there is, we have witnessed on television, where Palestinians are actually being bombed and homes are being destroyed. We're seeing that, but we're also seeing protests here in Canada, in North America, around the world, where people are literally basically saying enough is enough. And this is a global struggle. I mean, we saw the uprising last year with Blacks, Indigenous. There's something that's shifting also in terms of what is acceptable. I mean, we had a petition was signed by Jewish scholars and academics calling for an end, right, to Israel's escalation in the Middle East. We had a present letter that was led by Jewish scholars again, and academics, and Palestinians and Indigenous people, all saying, this has to end, right? We are living in a particular time where people are saying, our world is in crisis, and therefore our university is not an exception to actually being protected from this. And therefore, we too, within the institution, are implicated if we choose to be silent. Denise, did you want to say something?
So I agree with all of that. I'm very glad that people have brought this, kind of put this in the context of larger questions about the corporatization of the university, which has been going on for eons, it seems, and collegial governance, which is completely absent at the University of Toronto. But I just also wanted to, using the law school as the context, say a little bit about the interests of students in all of this. So academic freedom is not just about protecting the academics on faculty to be able to write about what they want to write about. It's also about creating an environment for students in which they have the liberty to let their intelligence roam freely and to learn about all kinds of things. And the one increasingly clear upshot of this whole scandal is that it is very likely that the International Human Rights Program will be destroyed by this. Already, many of their major NGO partners have pulled out. They have been without a director for 2 years. It's not looking like there's going to be able to be hiring for one that's going to put somebody in place in the fall. This is a program that created a remarkable opportunity for students to get hands-on experience working on international human rights issues, and it is at risk of being destroyed over this. It's not the only clinical program at the law faculty. There's a constitutional human rights program at the faculty as well, which just had its director, Kent Roach, resign from it because his thinking was, if the director of the International Human Rights Program doesn't have the freedom to take on whatever cases and whatever issues it seems best to that person to take on, then how can it be the case that the Asper Center for Constitutional Rights is going to be free to be able to do the work that it needs to do? These kinds of programs help to meet the needs of and profile issues of underdogs. And then students' learning is negatively affected, as well as those causes out in the world. Students' learning is affected as well.
David, let me bring you in here now, because I want us to look at the bigger context of, yes, concerns around donor influence in our sector, privatization of universities, and the lack of government funding for our public institutions. It's concerning. And in the political context of right now, we're seeing a real push in advocacy around weaponizing anti-Semitism and using that to deflect critique of the state of Israel. So Azarova's, the rescindment of offering Azarova this job is in the context of, at the same time, the push for universities across Canada to adopt the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's working definition of anti-Semitism, which essentially conflates critique of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism. So in many ways, this particular incident is not an isolated one. It's part of a larger struggle, is it not?
Absolutely. And I just want to go back to one point that Melanie raised, which I think is really important to underline. And that is, we shouldn't be surprised or shocked if donors think money buys influence. The old adage of the golden rule, whoever owns the gold sets the rules, right? What we should be shocked at is when administrations cave in and sacrifice their academic integrity. And administrators, as we see in this case, as we see in other cases, we've seen a long history of academic freedom in Canada, where academic freedom, our modern conception of it, was born at a time with the rise of private corporations and their influence over universities. Is administrators are not going to stand up for academic freedom. It's going to be up to the faculty. And faculty are going to have to come together and deal with that. On the question of the political context, Minsuk, I think that's really important, because it's not just the IRA definition. We're seeing a full-on assault beginning in the United States. I'm sure it's going to come here too, with state governments trying to ban the teaching of critical race theory, of feminist studies, of queer studies, anti-colonialism. I think we're in for a significant battle here, and academic freedom protects us. I'm absolutely convinced that without academic freedom, we wouldn't have critical race theory in the university right now. This is what allowed it to happen. But we're going to have to work really hard, because I'm very concerned about a whole right-wing assault on the institution that's linked to the politics of funding and so on, but I think it's also part of a political backlash about the current moment right now, and I'm quite concerned about statements that have been made by some premiers here in Canada, but even in France. There's a full-out assault by the French government on Islamic studies within universities. I mean, this is a pretty serious situation. And finally, I just say that the university has to be an incubator where we can explore new ideas and discuss controversial ideas, because if we can't be controversial in a university, there's no other public space we're going to be able to. So in order to advance knowledge, we have to be able to allow scholars to pursue the research that they think is important to pursue. And we can't have governments or donors or any other vested interest trying to contain that.
So it's really, I think the decision that CAUT has taken, and of course hasn't taken lightly, to censure is really significant in actually, a kind of precedent setting. In this case, it says, look, that we are not going to allow academic freedom or the rights of academic students and scholars, that their scholarship in areas undermined because of donors' influence and because of particular kinds of politics that determines who gets to say what and write what. So I think this is a very significant move and a significant step. And for any
Well, I wanted to just sort of intervene, because we do have this larger conversation that we've broached around philanthropy and the private sector integrating itself with the university. And this is a longer story. This goes back, and of which the Azarova affair is simply just one example. But one of the things, and I was prompted by something Melanie said when she was director of the Center for Caribbean Studies, is that one of the things that I'm beginning to see, of course, is in the advancement context, finding opportunities for diversifying how they operate ultimately can work to think proactively with supporting diverse programming. We've been experimenting at the Institute with this, and what it really comes down to is if we're going to, as universities, continue this model, and I don't see it abating anytime soon, then the very framework of philanthropy and advancement needs to be structured itself, needs to be governed with strong diversity and representative orientations. It can't just be about finding the biggest whale, is what I'm saying, right? If the idea around advancement is to go for the most wealthiest, the person with the biggest portfolio, you're going to code white. You just really are. That's just the nature of capital today. But what if you rather try to restructure the economics of advancement to also maximize philanthropic donations from equity groups? Then you also make a public university democratic, representatively democratic in that way as well. And so I'm not suggesting it's a great solution. Don't get me wrong. I would much rather the public sector do its job as it had in the past. But if this is where we're going to be, then there needs to be more effective governance and engagement between the academic components of university governance and advancement governance, but structured around the kinds of diversity that maximizes excellence, not the kind of homogeneity that precludes voices from being heard. And the strategy we've been trying to adopt has been successful at a small scale, but I don't see that happening at a large scale. And that, to me, is a concern around the way we govern, even the nexus between philanthropy and collegial governance.
Can I just jump in on that point to make a very small point about going forward here? So I think it's really important to notice that President Gertler did say that he accepted the concern raised by the Cromwell report that that there had been this breach of confidentiality in the advancement office. And of course, the University of Toronto doesn't want to allow this sort of thing to happen. And then he said, don't worry, folks, we'll fix it. So behind closed doors, he'll fix it, right? So this just carries on the U of T tradition of not actually dealing with these issues in a collegial fashion, not actually doing this democratically, to treating it as a top-down initiative of the president's office. If we leave this as it is, we will have no idea whether the administration fixed this in the advancement office, or whether it started again the day after Cromwell handed down his report, and nobody knows. Now, we don't know whether they're going to stop allowing this to happen, or whether they're going to get better at covering it up when it does happen. Without collegial supervision of what goes on in the advancement office, we'll never know.
I mean, and that's been a big theme.
And if I could say, can I say something quickly?
Yeah, sure.
Just a minute, Andrew. I just saw Melanie's hand.
Sure, sorry.
We'll give you.
Sorry.
Yeah.
You'll have so much to say, but I just want to say a couple of quick things about, I think one of the things, what is surprising or incredible about the situation is not just that it happened. I mean, it is an incredible set of events, but that we learned about it. And that, this is an opportunity. Like, I wish those in charge at the university would see this actually as an opportunity to meaningfully re-engage and renew their commitment to the kinds of questions that we're raising here, which is clearly not what they're doing. And they're behaving like many institutions do when caught, which is to double down, and which is rather than engaging in the kind of transparent, healthy processes that might actually get them out of this situation, they're just letting the poison spread. And not accepting that, in fact, if I personally was someone with a lot of money looking to invest it in a university, I would get to the page with U of T right now and be like, ew, let's just this is not, I don't even see how this serves their own narrow ends. It's clearly, something has gone terribly wrong here, and they need to own it. And the second thing that I would say is about this concept of academic freedom, which I also think that some right-wing movements try to conflate with freedom, with free speech, the right to say anything, with this very simplistic, very crass idea that, anything goes. Academic freedom is not the same as freedom of speech. I cannot get up in front of my class and tell them, that, I don't know, pink is green and up is down. There is actually in this world a difference between truth and lies. That does exist. That is a thing. And academic freedom should be committed to human rights. That should be a part of what is involved in academic freedom, that it should not be used as a means of undermining human rights. That should be a basic commitment that universities and governments who are facing this IRA definition should understand.
I have to make a
That's fantastic. I think that the discussion around academic freedom could take yet another panel, absolutely. But for sure, I think, stating quite boldly that academic freedom is not a license to, to use hate speech. It's not a license to use racial slurs, and it doesn't give you a pass. I think that is absolutely something that we need to underscore as we talk about the need to practice academic freedom. Now, we do have to wrap up. And in sum, I just want to ask, perhaps each of you, what I found really interesting, Anver, one of the first things you said at the beginning was that the law school, the faculty, didn't even have a listserv where everyone was in one listserv. It had to actually be put together because of this situation. And what is so important about this moment is the need to organize, to self-organize, and to speak up, because academic freedom really is pointless unless you exercise it, is it not?
Oh, absolutely. Speaking up is incredibly important, particularly in an environment, as Denise was saying, where we're asked to defer to the dean, defer to the president, defer to Cromwell. But we're academics. Our job is to question. And if we're not doing our job, even in the way we govern, how can we have the dignity or earn the respect of our students in the work that we otherwise publish?
Okay, thank you. Thank you all. Unfortunately, we have to end. This was an incredible conversation, amazing. Thank you so much for all of the robust and amazing conversations and pieces that we were able to pull out in such a short space of time, which is just 1 hour. I want to thank the panelists again for this, and to also thank the followers on Facebook and YouTube. Thank you to Marianne from CCS for the closed caption, and thank you to Rejan for tech support. Thank you all, and I think, Minsuk, you want to sort of add our events coming up next week?
We're good. I think people can follow us on our website, scholarstrikecanada.ca, and you'll see petitions and more information that you can find around this subject and many more. We are doing programming around anti-Asian racism at the end of this month, so check out our website to learn more about that. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you
So much.
Thank you.